Welcome and welcome back. Leagues has come and gone, and I thought it would be fun to kind of wrap up by ranking absolutely everything. And if you weren't aware, I was streaming basically every day during the leagues, and I ended up getting 3 accounts together, all maxed out in the Relics, different types of builds, which meant I got to experience everything that Leagues had to offer. So yes, we are going to be ranking the Relics, the areas, the Masteries, the Echo junk, as well as the League just in general, comparing it to the other leagues as a nice little send-off. So where I would like to start is the Combat Masteries. Now, I'll be evaluating it off of basically 3 things: healing, the tier 6 effect, and the big numbers that you can hit with this stuff, because who doesn't love to have big numbers when you're in the league running around smacking on monsters? Now, there are definitely a lot of different combinations that I saw a lot of people use, and I'm not necessarily going to talk about the best of the best combo in that regard, but there's definitely some clear winners. So let's start with the heals. You've got the melee side of things, 5% chance to heal 40% of the damage. You've got ranged every 5th hit, healing 5 hit points, and then magic, when you roll above a 90% of your max, you heal 10%. This also takes into account the passive healing that you get, so actually they're all a little bit stronger. Range, for example, is actually going to heal 6 hit points every 5th hit. But in terms of how this feels in the game, it's more like this, where you have ranged heals so consistently, so much, and then you have everything else. And like, I think magic was maybe a little better than the melee stuff. I mean, man, the melee healing, you almost never felt it. You had to do like Guthans or a Blood Fury or both to really like actually have melee healing, which I think is a bit of a shame. Yeah, because you just compare it to these other two. Melee was almost nothing. Magic, I could kind of feel it from time to time. There's some weird anti-synergies with how it was calculating out like the max hit, and also like, if a certain mob had like below a certain threshold of HP, and maybe you had like the tier 6, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, that would like guarantee the final hit to be whatever that HP value was, and it was less than your max, you still wouldn't heal. And so it felt really inconsistent for magic as well. But magic also had blood spells, assuming that you went for ancients. But I think if you did a magic build, you'd probably end up with ancients. So this one was maybe a little less important for magic. But yes, range is definitely the clear winner of the bunch, even as a secondary heal, meaning maybe if you went all the way down the melee tree or all the way down the magic tree, if range was your secondary and you got up to 4 points, this thing was still extremely consistent when you were using it. Now, talking about the tier 6 effects, again, I feel like the clear winner in this category ends up being ranged with the never miss. Meaning you can use ranged with like full tank armor on just about any boss, unless they happen to be like literally immune to range damage, and there's very few where that's true. You just use ranged everywhere. Now, I thought that the melee echo hits would be cool, and I mean, it is fun to see more hits, but I was kind of underwhelmed actually by the melee echoes. I felt like I wasn't getting them that often. And then when it came to magic, well, yeah, we're gonna cross that one out, because again, there's some weird like anti-synergy with how it was calculating that. What it's supposed to do is give you more max hits based on how much HP the thing has, so you hit better on like bigger mobs. You're not going to use that most of the time. So really the selling point of the tier 6 was the sort of like execute. If there were less hit points on the mob than what your max hit was, then you would just guarantee finish it off. Now, the problem is travel time on magic spells was one issue. So like, even if it procced, you're probably getting 2 or 3 spells off in the time it takes for the spell to travel to the mob. So it's a little bit of wasted effort there. You have to really pay attention. And it didn't seem like it calculated all of the different damage percentages that you could have for magic. And so really, if you're hitting like the dummy in your play your own house and your max is like a 150 and you're like, cool, I can go and execute things that are 150 HP, that wasn't actually true, and you'd only end up executing things at like 100 HP, for example, right? Like, there was some discrepancy there, and it was quite noticeable, to the point where, man, it just did not feel as good as it sounded. Sounded great in practice. I mean, it made some of the smaller stuff more consistent, and things like the Inferno, going through some of the earlier waves, dealing with like the Nibblers as well. So it did definitely help with like those lower end things, but once you started getting above certain thresholds like 60, 70, 80 HP mobs, it was really hard to tell even when using something like the Shadow, it didn't seem like it was consistently being able to execute those types of mobs in one hit, which is like, I don't know how exactly they were calculating that, but it's super, super disappointing. Now, onto that last thing, the big numbers. Obviously, if you wanted to hit big numbers, you were going to take the Relic Last Stand as your tier 8. Again, we'll be talking about those here shortly, but even outside of Last Stand, I want to talk about, like, how did these all stack up? And really, they were all, like, fairly similar. I mean, I think Melee had the largest max hit that you could get to with something like Darox. I mean, maybe the Shadow with Last Stand could get above what I'm showing here. I didn't get the chance to try Last Stand for all of these different combat styles, but I will say, like, once you get above, like, 150 as a number, even if it's, like, a combination of numbers, I think you've kind of won the big number thing. So I don't know that I would say any of these beats out the other here. Definitely, Darox wasn't, like, the most consistent, but you had some good echo weapons. You had the Scythe, which would put out a lot of damage as well. Basically, all of the mega rares, they would hit like a truck. So I think all of them did fairly well in dealing big numbers. Of course, with range, you have Never Missing, which that does matter. Magic splashed a ton, and that made it significantly more disappointing. And actually, Magic ran into the issue where you had such a wide range of numbers that you could hit because of how all of the damage pieces calculated together. You'd go from hitting 1, splashing 3 times, to hitting like 120. And it felt way more inconsistent. So definitely Magic struggled, but in terms of just getting big hits out there, they all did quite well, I think. So if I'm going to rank these, ranged, I mean, I keep saying it, the clear winner, range definitely felt the best. There are some things to say about, like, because you never miss, you don't quite have the same need to progress in your gear. And I do know that took away for a lot of people. But I think even with that in mind, if you just wanted to kind of play the league casually, enjoy your time, have an easy time with all the different tasks, range definitely felt like it was the top pick. Melee came in at second for me. Now, personally, I think Melee had a lot of variety there, a lot of weapon choices. It got a lot of attention from the echoes as well. And so these actually aren't that far apart. I think that you could have had a lot of fun with a Melee build or a range build. I am putting it in second place by comparison, but I really don't think the gap is that large between the two. I think Melee did fairly well, even though the healing wasn't that great. If you went Melee, you probably ended up going Moritania anyway, and so you were able to pick up that Blood Fury and the Guthan set. Now, if you did maybe like the Kopish build, went like the Wilderness, Taranwin, and something else, and it wasn't Moritania, I mean, you probably still should have gotten Moritania, but if you took like Fremnik instead, you would be struggling a little bit on those heals, and you definitely start to feel that. But at least in terms of like the damage output, if you went that route, you had things like the Kopish, which are really high damage, so I don't think it would end up being that big of a deal for you. And then, of course, in last place, I'm not even going to give it third, Magic. Dude, the splashing. Oh, the splashing. Oh my god, dude. Like, Magic felt really strong in the early game. And even as a Melee build, I was leaning on Magic for a lot of the damage. But then once you get into the mid game, Magic is completely useless. Like, it's so hard to find upgrades to get those max hits to progress. It's basically like start of the game really strong, and then there's nothing until the Shadow. And the splashing in particular, that really killed it. Like, you could not go to any of the bosses in the mid game and fight them like you could if you were Melee or ranged. You basically had to go and focus the Shadow, which I think is, I mean, I guess if you went into it knowing that, it's probably not that big of a deal for you. I like to experience the progress through the main game and kind of having these incremental steps. And Magic really just, it was lacking that because, man, just the amount of splashing that you would do on these bosses. So many bosses have high Magic defense. And yes, once you get the Shadow, you're able to tackle most of those. I say most, it still struggles, I think, compared to the other two styles, even with the Shadow. Like, range, you're going to every boss. Melee, you're going to basically every boss unless you can't melee it because it's like flying or whatever, right? And Magic is one where, like, you try it, you kind of see some of them it's going to be okay because the Shadow has just that much accuracy kind of baked into it. But some, even with that, like, the Duke and the Fremnik area, like, yeah, it can technically get through it, but you're still splashing quite a lot, and it just does not feel like a good experience. So, Rip Magic, it doesn't even get to be on the podium. Sorry, buddy. And really drive this point home, I just wanted to say, this was my best mage build. Dude, man, the Drygore Blowpipe, when it competes with the Shadow in a mage setup, just, it's so disappointing. I really wanted mage to feel better than it did. And I originally, when I started leagues, I wanted to do a mage build, but gosh dang, man, it just was not there. There's too much like anti-synergy in the combat masteries. The gear progression just didn't feel that good, and the fact that you end up splashing so much anyway, I feel bad. I feel bad for mage. You know, you could have had fun with mage, and I do think if I really like leaned into it in my first account, I would have been fine grinding things out. It's not like it's that much worse than the other two, but I mean, even still, the discrepancy between them having not started with mage, it is extremely noticeable. But enough about Masteries. Let's take a look at the relics. There were a lot of choices, and I'm actually going to try and tier list them, and we're just going to go through each tier of these and kind of like rank them on the board, see how they hold up. So you had Power Miner, Lumberjack, and the Animal Wrangler. I will say, as tough as I was on Lumberjack leading up to the league, I didn't hate it that much. It was still good, great for AFK especially. Like Animal Wrangler and Lumberjack both made AFK, both made the skills that they're respectively tied to completely AFK. And I think especially if you want that sort of like passive style in the game, both of them were fine. It is tough to compare Lumberjack between the other two just because of the things that it solves and the things that it does. Lumberjack's fletching XP was trash. Arrow shafts from logs, it's just not good, right? And fire making and woodcutting aren't tough skills to solve. But you could say the same thing about like fishing and cooking for Animal Wrangler, but Animal Wrangler helped a ton with Hunter as well. And even if they are easier skills, I think the speed up that you get from Animal Wrangler is just really tough to compete with. And it's similarly to Power Miner, like while it doesn't make things AFK for you, it solves smithing, so it's a very like area specific thing. The crafting XP, even on the gem rocks, I didn't find was like that crazy. It was fine. But again, I think the use cases for Lumberjack unfortunately just aren't there, so it kind of suffers a bit. But in general, I kind of liked all of the Gathering Relics this time around. I'm putting Animal Wrangler up in A and the other two in B. I am putting Lumberjack last, but I don't think it needs to be like a D tier by any means. I think the AFK that it offers is still pretty good. So all of them I felt were like fairly well balanced for the most part. I really wish that they could have given us more fletching XP per log. I think that would have bumped this one up quite a bit. Or some of the suggestions that people were throwing out, there was like a percentage chance to make planks while you're cutting logs as well. I think that could have helped elevate it too. Power Miner is just, it's very, like I said, it's very area specific with like the smithing piece. I, for sure, with the areas on my first count, if I didn't take this, I would not have gotten my smithing to 99 because I didn't have a better solve for it. But there's some other ways to solve for smithing, whether it be area choices or other relics, that I don't know that this one is entirely necessary. And man, if they fix the fletching XP on this one, I'd be more than happy to stick this up into A tier. But the fletching XP I just think is too weak on this. Now, in the tier 2 relics, we had Corner Cutter, the Friendly Forager, as well as Dodgy Deals. And I think most of you know this, Dodgy Deals was a crazy pick. Not only because it solved thieving, but also with underwater agility, everybody had access to it. It would essentially solve agility for you as well. And then you'd have some secondary effects of like getting clue scrolls more easily, being able to kind of thieve stuff from the Tazar area, work on your crafting, on your smithing as well. And it would also solve some of your early game money problems. The GP wasn't exactly like crazy with Dodgy Deals, but again, I don't think the other option, which would be Corner Cutters for that early cash, I don't think it performed any better than Dodgy Deals. So as like an early game money solve, this one also helped out there. The other popular pick that I saw from people was Friendly Forager, and I do get it. Secondary is on Herblore, quite annoying. And actually the little bits of XP drops that you get while you're gathering stuff, especially if you pair it with something like Animal Wrangler and the Lumberjack Relic, it ends up adding up quite a lot. On the account where I ended up going Forager, I think I ended up at like 80 plus Herblore, mainly just from gathering. That was the account where I had Lumberjack and this one, and just like sitting on magic trees for 10 hours, 20 hours, as I'm like slowly getting towards those 50 mil milestones for woodcutting and fire making, you get a pretty healthy amount of herbs. So it was definitely a good solve. And that it's a bit of a tough one to place in comparison to Dodgy Deals, though, because I feel like Dodgy Deals offers way more. Corner Cutters just doesn't really do enough, I think, to compete on this level. It also had some issues with like having the lap counts on things like the 8 Patrol course, just it didn't work. And so Corner Cutters ended up being kind of the saddest relic of the bunch. The first one I'm going to place down in D tier, just because it really, like, Dodgy Deals outclassed it so significantly at its own job. The only real benefit you could say for this is, like, it was passive agility XP. But, like, over the course of 2 months, I don't personally value it that much. I know for some of the, like, speedrun accounts, it may have made some sense. But outside of that, I just don't think it performed very well. There weren't a lot of agility tasks either. So, D tier for that one. The Friendly Forager, like, there's a case for it. I just don't think it competes on the same level with Dodgy Deals. I think Dodgy Deals is still better for, like, 99% of people. And you're going to come back around and solve Herblore with one of the later relics anyway. More than likely. But we'll talk about that here in a minute. Tier 3, this was the Teleport Relics. I don't have a lot to say about this one, because there was a clear winner, and it was the Clue Compass. The Clue Compass had so much going for it that the other two they can't compete at all. I feel so bad for people who ended up taking not Clue Compass, or they reloaded into 2 of them. It's critic. You know, there's basically no reason not to take the Clue Compass. It solves clues, it teleports you to a bank, and it has kind of like the most interesting spread of teleports. There's some cool things that you could do with it based on like the types of clue steps that you got. So certainly there are better use cases in certain areas. So like Mauritania, being able to teleport back and forth between the Barrows chest and the top of the mounds with the Clue Compass, or being in like Fremnik and getting the Clue teleport that takes you to the Dagannoth King ladder. So there are certain areas that benefited more, but just in general, I mean, Fairy's Flight didn't really do much for you. Yeah, you could use it for like farm runs, but again, I don't think that's like a crazy use case. Bank Heist, it just, I mean, you already get a bank with Clue Compass. There's basically no reason to do Bank Heist at all. So just a very weak spread compared to the Clue Compass. Man, why on earth they included teleporting you to your current clue step when comparison to these other two? I'm like, God, if they're going to give the Clue Compass that, they really should have given something else to both of these. I don't know, dude. Oh, poor other teleport relics. Moving into tier 4, you had a choice between the Golden God relic, the Reloaded relic, and Equilibrium. I want to start with Equilibrium. I was quite on the fence about this one. I know this is Double Shine's like favorite relic ever. I'm not convinced. I think it's not flashy enough. It does give a lot of XP. Over the course of the one account where I had Equilibrium, I think it ended up adding a solid like 20-ish% across my total XP. How much does that matter? How much do you care? You know, like, yes, the XP drops are better. Yes, it makes like those random small XP drops suddenly way more meaningful. But I think in leagues, most of the time, you're spending your time doing like large XP drop type of activities. Like, you don't necessarily want to prioritize this like low XP stuff. I mean, like, yeah, there's some fun things you can do. Like, you can go and AFK the Rune Essence mine, especially if you have something like Power Miner, right? But like, it's not that strong. And I felt it the most early on training skills, and I felt it the most in like skills that already offered kind of like small frequent XP drops. So this one I paired with the Lumberjack relic and the Friendly Forager relic. And so like the tiny little XP drops that you'd get for the herbs, the tiny XP drops on fletching arrow shafts, all of those increased quite a lot. And it would end up being like 25 or 30% of my total XP in those skills. But it doesn't do that for every skill. And again, it just doesn't feel flashy. And I think in leagues, you want to feel that power. So I just don't think that this one performed that well. Between the other two choices, with Reloaded, you're probably taking it to pick any of these 5. I mean, I know a couple of people picked up Corner Cutters just for the sake of making agility easier. You're not really looking at taking this to pick previous teleport relics. That would be a mistake. Ask the man in the frog mask, he'll tell you. You know, it can help solve like specific problems, but I think the most generally widely applicable, the one that a lot of people picked, was Golden God. This one just solved your cash problem completely. It solved prayer for you, magic for you, and while I don't think either of those skills were like that crazy to solve, it also let you buy things noted from the shops, and so you had downstream effects of having a lot of cash, buying a lot of node things. It could immediately solve your supply needs for like food. You can go and buy essentially infinite Karambwans. You can essentially go and get anything from the Tazar shops, which solves things like crafting, like smithing. If you had Varlamore or Fremnik, it completely solved construction for you. You could do some really crazy fast methods, get like 50 mil construction in the course of like an hour or two. And so this one I think was the most powerful feeling when compared to the other two. Reloaded, I think, was still good. Equilibrium, I don't know. It's tough for me to recommend that for anybody after the fact. And so I'm going to put Golden God up in A tier. And the only reason I don't quite put it up into S is because on the account where I used it, once Golden God solves the things that it solves, you're kind of done with it. So outside of like the first week or two, maybe, and depending on how hard you focus on the different things that it can kind of help you with, I really didn't use it at all. And I mean, I guess technically you can say that about the other relics too, but I think it's because there's not like the alchemy effect on stuff. It's just not that important once you get up to max cash. You solve for construction. It's probably like the most fun piece from it. And then the rest of it, you kind of need to pair it with something else in order to like really make it good. Having infinite supplies is always going to be a good thing, but you need to pair it with like one of the later relics like Production Master to really help you get through that stack quickly. Otherwise, it only solved like half of the problem for you. B tier for Reloaded, and that's more just because, I mean, you're picking this to pick any of the other lower relics, and none of them are like that high, so I'm just kind of picking a middle of the road one for this. Though I really liked the concept of it. The idea of being able to go back and redo a choice, I thought was a really interesting thing to add into the league. And while I know a lot of people went for Golden God, I really appreciated that it kind of opened up some additional pathways for us to solve different problems. And then for Equilibrium, low C tier, it is a lot of XP. It's just not flashy enough. Like, outside of adding more XP to it, I don't know how you really solve this relic to make it feel like it can compete with the other two. I think over a long enough time frame, it's going to give you enough XP to have been worth the choice. It's just, are you going to be playing that much on one account for the 2-month time frame? I think there's not a lot of people that's going to apply to, so I think you're going to have more fun if you took one of the other two options. Now, moving into tier 5, you had the Treasure Arbiter, which essentially solved clues. You had Production Master, which helped you with all of the production skills, and then you had Slayer Master. And for this one, definitely Production Master over the other two is like a general use case. Slayer Master was very specific. If you're going to go for Mauritania, I think Slayer Master was a great one because it would mean you get that Black Mask, you get 15% damage bonus on literally everything. Whether or not that was intentional, it did. The Slayer Master thing worked on literally everything, and so you were getting that just flat damage bonus. It also worked really well with certain areas that had like keys related to it, so things like Karend or the Wilderness. So Slayer Master was a nice kind of like quality of life one. Treasure Arbiter, they cut way back on the clue tasks, but there were still a lot of clue tasks, so it did all right. It is really fun being able to open clues quickly and get just a ton of rewards for them. But again, Production Master, the skilling, all of the points behind the like 99, 25 mil, 35 mil, 50 mil, all of those tasks, plus being able to speed yourself up in the early game to get to some of the higher tier equipment that you have to make yourself since you are an Iron Man. I think that was really like a big selling point of taking Production Master. And so I'm putting this one in S tier. Production Master, you get to be at the top. I'm putting it slightly below the Clue Compass because I just think the Clue Compass solves like so much for being such an early on relic, which is crazy. And actually the Clue Compass it doesn't totally invalidate Treasure Arbiter, but man, it really takes a chunk out of this one. And since everybody and their mother was taking this, I mean, Treasure Arbiter, yes, you've got like collection log points. Yes, you've got completing clues for points. Certain like wear a trimmed piece or a gilded piece or whatever. Like you had some various tasks related to it. But in the end, I don't think it was actually that many points. And so I didn't feel stressed about taking this relic. Now, if you're doing something specific, cool. You want to go for like the Bloodhound pet, great. That was the relic for you. But no, I think for most people, this is where it falls. And then for the Slayer relic, because it's kind of like really area specific, it depends. Like I think a lot of melee builds would have benefited from taking it just because you're probably going to end up in Mauritania as a melee build. But it's hard for me to give it like a blanket high tier recommendation, so top of B feels about right for me. Moving on to tier 6, we had Banker's Note and Total Recall. I thought for sure this was going to be a closer call, but man, you guys blew it out of the water. And like 97% of people or something ridiculous like that picked Banker's Note over Total Recall. And I get it. I actually think they both perform a very similar function. Banker's Note, Total Recall, they let you just kind of like more or less have infinite supplies, but Banker's Note is more widely applicable and it lets you do more things in general. And because of that, I mean, you can essentially like skill anywhere you want because you can keep this stack of noted things on you and just unnote them. You're in between boss kills, you want to cut some gems? Cool. You just unnote a bunch of gems. You want to make some potions? Cool. There you go. You're making some potions, right? Right in the middle of next, you're like, oh man, I really wish I had some more prayer pots. Oh, good thing I brought my stack of unfinished Ranar pots. You're just skilling in the middle of all your bossing, you know what I mean? Like, yes, they can both kind of perform that function in a way, but Banker's Note does it better. Now, Total Recall did have some specific use cases, particularly with special attacks, because you would save your stats, including you'd save your HP, your prayer, as well as your special attack. And so being able to reset yourself that special attack definitely helped in certain circumstances. Also, the ability to save your spot in like really specific areas could help with certain skills, but it was tough to compete directly with Banker's Note. And unless you had some really specific plans in mind, Total Recall just couldn't quite get there. But if you took it, I still think it was strong. It just, yeah, Banker's Note just kind of rolled over that one for most folks. Then you come into Tier 7. Tier 7, I personally found a little bit underwhelming for how far into the game you had to be versus the power that it gave you. Now, Kingdom suffers from the fact that it's kind of locked in at mid-tier resources for things like herbs. I mean, you can only get coal, so you can't even get like other types of ores and things. The fish are kind of like lower tier fish. Logs, they're only ever maple. And so as many supplies as Kingdom would give you, they're all kind of like those low or mid-tier supplies, which made it not feel nearly as strong as it could have. Grimoire definitely helped kind of round out some builds. So not to throw shade at Grimoire, I mean, it is a good thing to have. I just don't know for how late you're coming into this. Like, how much more meaningful would this be as like a tier 3 or tier 4 choice, and you're starting to get kind of like these really powerful prayers and some additional spells to choose from? Whereas when you get into late game, when you're like actually coming up to this relic, you've kind of already got all the stuff that you need. Yeah, it's still going to be a nice improvement in terms of like damage from the prayers. You'll be able to maybe do some cool build things if you're like trying to get a specific prayer book like Ancients without the desert. So like there are some use cases for it. I just don't know that it felt that strong. It's just a really similar feeling to like the Pocket Kingdom as well. And then you had the farming relic over here, Overgrown, where it would kind of like auto replant stuff for you. Great solve for herblore, great solve for farming. I did like it. I kind of wish it did a little more for being a tier 7 relic, but I did definitely use this to full effect on my main account. I mean, it's a free 50 mil farming. It does help with herblore. Granted, if you don't have production prodigy, it's kind of annoying to get through all of the herbs, but at least you've got the herbs available to you. With that, I'm putting Overgrown at the top, kind of like the low end of A. And again, that's just because it comes in so late that I think it would have felt a little better if it came a little sooner. And I feel that same way about all of the stuff in Tier 7. It just didn't feel like it had enough of a power spike for how long I was waiting to get this thing. Grimoire, again, because it's kind of like an area-specific thing, it has some general power boost in a similar way to like the Slayer Relic does. But because you're probably picking this if you want like certain builds, it's kind of like a middle-of-the-road relic. And then the fact that Pocket Kingdom is so locked in at those low-tier resources, it really just takes away a lot of the power that this could have had. I think if they were going to improve this relic specifically, uncapping what Kingdom can give you, I think would be a really interesting way to kind of like improve this relic and bump it up a bit. But as it stands, low C, I think you were better off picking one of the other two. I think this one just ended up being too much of a disappointment. And then we have Tier 8. And I know for a lot of folks, Last Stand was the one that they picked. This meant when you got down to 1 HP, you'd go into like this invincible mode, your stats would get boosted up to 255, you'd do some crazy damage. It had a 3-minute cooldown, but you could kind of get around that by, just you do your thing, you kill the bosses, you go back to Lumbridge, and then you go back to the boss if you really wanted to speed that up. But it also, even if you didn't do that, it made bossing in general a lot cozier, a lot more AFK, a lot more chill. right? Because you have this safety net available to you. It also really helped with things like the Inferno or the Colosseum, because these really long, like, wave-based things, you get to the end, and then to get one shot, it sucks. It happened to me on my last account, which didn't have this. It happened in, what, 3? I tried the Inferno 3 times on that account, and man, I just got smacked down every time, and it feels so bad when you've gone through, like, that hour of work, and you make one mistake, and then that's it. And sometimes it's not even your mistake. I know one of them I died to lag, and, like, there's just nothing you can do about it, you know? So I really liked Last Stand for that. It also meant really big hits, so if you were looking to do some, like, fun builds, Darok stuff, Twisted Bow even, I mean, like, the stats just made everything hit crazy big. We also had Guardian. Guardian would summon essentially like an empowered thrall, and this one suffers from a similar problem, I think, to Equilibrium, where technically speaking, it gives you like a lot of damage. It also helps a lot because the little thing that it summons will use like whatever weakness it needs to. It can help with things like Tormented Demons by hitting it off prayer and causing it to switch to another style, allowing you to camp your main style more. But the fact that we had Prayer Pen in the combat masteries, the fact that you could still like get all of these big hits with Last Stand, I think it didn't show enough to make Guardian feel that worth it. So at least between these two, Last Stand was definitely the choice. Specialist really only functioned specifically for the Thunder Kopish, the Echo Weapon from the Wilderness, debatably the Dog Sword, debatably the Zerite Crossbow. But I think the strongest use case for a Specialist was that Kopish Blade. And so it was super, super specific. Like, there'd be hardly any people that would take this. You'd have to build around the Specialist Relic in order to really get some use out of it. So all of that said, Last Stand definitely going into S tier. Really strong. I really love this style of Relic. They had something similar in the previous league as well, and I felt the same way. Like, just having that extra safety net, just kind of making it easy. It also helps you with supplies too. I mean, even if you didn't have Banker's Note, so like on my main account, I had Total Recall and Last Stand. I essentially never needed food for any of the bossing that I did outside of kind of those longer wave things. And even still, you could cheese a lot of aspects of the game with Last Stand. And so the use cases for it were super widely applicable. Specialist, I'm putting at the top of B. Now, I know not a lot of people would take this, but when you built around it, it was a lot of fun. So it's a little bit tough to rate it against the rest of these relics, but I feel like middle of the road is probably the best for this one. Kind of like Grimoire, kind of like the Slayer relic. It's too specific to really rank it highly, but man, if you're looking for the job that it's doing, it does it really well. And then Guardian, again, since I don't think you feel it enough. It's not necessarily a bad relic, but considering you're going all the way to tier 8, you're having to get all of those league tasks. If you got here and then you pick this one, compared to something like Last Stand, I just don't think you feel it enough to really make it a worthwhile choice. So that's why I'm putting it down here in C. And then just to kind of like light them all up, this is the final tier list for all the relics from this year. And just for the sake of fun, you know, what would this mean in terms of like my optimal generalistic path for relics? And it would be these relics here. These are the ones that all fall into the S or the A tier from the different tiers of relics. Now, I never got to try this combo specifically in the league, but since I got to try out kind of all of the relics, looking at this, I think you would have a pretty good time in the league if this is what you ended up taking. And I would not be surprised if a lot of you ended up with this exact pick, because reading through the descriptions of a lot of these, I think this, even not having experienced this, even if I hadn't experienced the relics firsthand, I think the ones that read the best are probably this selection here too. So you'll have to let me know. How'd you feel about the relic ratings, and did you end up with this exact spread? I bet a lot of you did. But all right, now on to the Echo items, and I am going to do the bosses and the items separate because I think the items are going to play into the boss ratings themselves. So just isolating the items and looking at what it is that they do, there are a lot of them, and this was kind of like the selling point for this league. You got the Echo bosses that give you these kind of special items. So starting off, this was the old tier list before coming into the league. I'll show this again after I've kind of ranked everything just so we can compare it a little bit. But this is where I expected everything to fall. Now, the first one was the Drygor Blowpipe. This was in the desert. This is essentially a ranged fang. The passive was getting that accuracy. It was a little bit odd because the tier 6 mastery for range is you never miss, and so you don't really get to take advantage of that accuracy passive on the Dragor blowpipe. So it just feels a little weird that they designed these two things together. But I will say the Dragor as a secondary range weapon, meaning, you know, you only went up to like 4 or 5 points in range, so you'd never ended up with the full-on never miss passive here from the 6th mastery. It was quite good to have this. It really, really helped, and especially because at tier 3, darts and knives became 1 tick, and so being able to take this, you get a little bit of extra range strength, and you get more accuracy on top of that. It actually functioned extremely well as that secondary item pick for you. And because of that, I'm actually going to bump it up into A tier. I did use this a lot on my mage account. As you saw earlier, it was part of the best mage build, unfortunately, you know, so like, it was very strong for what it was doing. And especially if you didn't have Tehran win for a blowpipe option, this did still give you a little bit of extra range strength. Not quite as strong as the blowpipe, but every little bit adds up there. Next, we got the dog sword. This one came from Asgarnia, Echo Cerberus, and it was just a combination of all of the different god sword specials. You kind of had to pair it with like the specialist, maybe debatably last recall as well, but this one wasn't like the best special to spam. It was nice to have. It was kind of a gimmicky weapon, so ultimately, it didn't really have a lot of like crazy use cases or anything. It's just kind of like a fun addition if you happen to have Asgarnia in your route. So I wasn't overly impressed by this. Still leaving it in C tier. I don't think there was that much going for it. It was just kind of like fun to play around with if you had it. But I mean, in the end, it was kind of like a meme weapon anyway. So I don't think anyone was really expecting this one to be like S tier weapon or anything. But speaking of S tier weapons, a little bit of a spoiler, you had the Coppish Blade and the 1000 Dragon Ward, both of which came from the Wilderness. Man, was this stacked for like a melee build, and especially if you want to do a special build, pair this with Last Recall, which worked extremely well in the Wilderness, and the Specialist Relic at tier 8, giving you 5 full Coppish specs. It's a ton of damage, and it's because the stats on it, it's like the Blade of Salador. I had a kid with the Void Waker. Also, it's AoE on the specials. I mean, man, the damage that this thing output was crazy. And you pair it with the Dragon Ward, which had better offensive stats than like the highest level defender in the game. Plus, it also had all those defensive stats. Plus, it made you immune to any status effects. So if you had the Wilderness, and shoot, I mean, even if you were going like a range or magic build, the shield was so good to just pair with whatever you were doing. So because of that, it's definitely going to sit in S tier. It was in S tier at the start. It's still in S tier. This thing was so strong. Even if you didn't do Total Recall or the Specialist build, the Coppish Blade still would smack extremely hard on most bosses. Next up, we had the Fancy Barrow's Gloves coming from Mauritania. And I don't know. I had high hopes for this one going into the league. But I think the problem is like Barrow's gear just isn't that good. There were some specific use cases for it, with Darox and Last Stand being able to get some like really crazy hits out there. There's also a good use case with like Guthans being able to heal just an absolute ton. But it really didn't help Carol's or Aram's that much. I mean, Carol's already not that good. Aram's, I mean, you don't get magic stats on the glove slot, so yes, it has that chance to give you the larger max hits for magic, but I just don't think it performed that well. Yeah, as like just a stat spot for your melee build, it was fine. I don't know, it ended up not being that interesting, I don't think, compared to some of the other Echoes. And so because of that, I'm moving it way down from A, where it was originally for me, I think down to C. I'm putting it a little bit above the Dog Sword, just because I think the things that it did well, it did really well, even if it wasn't like widely applicable. Whereas the Dog Sword, again, it's just kind of there for the meme, you know? It's not like bad to have it, but it's just, it doesn't have a lot of like cool, fun interactions like the Barrow's Gloves did. Next up, we have the Stat Sticks from Fremnik, the jewelry. And really, there's not a lot to say about this because it really is just stats. It's better than like if you combine all of the best jewelry in the game. That's what these two did. And I'll say it's not that interesting as an item. So it kind of pains me to keep it in S tier here. Man, I'm a sucker for like more interesting interactions than what these provided, but it is so hard not to put it in S tier for the amount of stats that it gave you. Even if it was just supplementing some other build that you did, it was a lot of stats. And it was almost required, I would say, for range. and definitely required for mage. And the fact that these items were required if you really wanted to like get that damage out there, I think really just helps solidify it in that top tier slot. Next, we have the Devil's Element from Kandarin, and man, what can I say about this? Did you know that it takes 93 Slayer to even like access this thing? And it's kind of like mid-game level stats in your shield slot. Also, did you know the Shadow is a two-handed weapon? So like you can't even get use out of it as you like get your later game weapons. And I hear you saying, oh, but it had that whole elemental weakness thing. That's kind of cool. And I know I talked about how difficult it was to like pick good areas with elemental weaknesses to be able to take advantage of it. One of them that I especially liked were all of the metal dragons with the 50% earth weakness. And I did try this, but you know what the problem is with going for metal dragons with this thing? Metal dragons still need you to equip a shield or you're going to get absolutely wrecked. And so like, oh my God, dude, what? Like, if they had put this in another slot, I think it would have been way better. But the fact that it was a shield slot, I mean, some of the interactions, like, it was a cool thought experiment, but I don't think we're quite there yet with the elemental weaknesses being widely available. I really wish they had leaned into something like making your elemental spells better rather than weaknesses specifically. That way you could have used it on more stuff. Giving it an accuracy boost as well, I think would have really helped in that kind of like mid-game drought, even though 93 Slayer, oh man, that takes a while to get to. But even if you had to grind out Slayer to get to that, to then be able to take on some of these bosses that have other gear upgrades for you in the mid-game, that accuracy would have gone such a long way. Shoot, even give it like an accuracy passive similar to the Shadow, because it's not like it can be used with the Shadow in the shield slot. I don't know, but if it was used in another slot, you could also, like have your Dragon Fire Shield, go to Metal Dragons, and kind of like play around with it in that way. But man, there's going to be a trend, I'm telling you, with the Kandarin and stuff. Devil's Element gets its own tier. It is D tier for Devil's Element. God, dude. I mean, I desperately wanted Magic to feel better this year than it did, and just everything was working against Magic, I feel like. We got to move on or I'm going to get depressed talking about that Devil's Element, dude. We're going to come back and we're going to talk about the Echo Smoke Devil or whatever, the Echo Thermi. It's not good. it's not good. The Crystal Blessing, which you got from Taranwen. This one allowed you to take advantage of the crystal armor bonuses for your melee weapons, and I did think this was very good, especially if you wanted to do kind of like a max damage melee build. So this would be like Wilderness for the Coppish Blade, Taranwen for the crystal armor, because you could get, and then you pair that with Moritania for the Slayer Helm, which would take the place of the Crystal Helm, and you'd end up with like a flat, I mean, what is that? 27.5 extra damage, plus the accuracy as well, 45% more accuracy. So it was just like a crazy hard-hitting thing to include with your melee build. And because you're probably already grinding this out for the Bofa, it meant that you had a good way to like switch between melee and range without having to bring, like an 8-way switch or whatever to change out all of your armor, which I definitely appreciate out of this item. Now, because it doesn't really help Magic any, it's a little specific. You still have to grind for it. It only works with the Bofa in terms of the range weapons. It does make it a little more limited, but for the melee build, it was like crazy good. So kind of balancing that out, I'm throwing it onto the end of A tier. I do think it was a good item, and especially if you're building around it, it definitely helped Taranwen a lot. Next, we have the Nature's Reprisal. This is essentially like a salamander with a crossbow range coming from Kourend. It hits in a similar range to the Trident of the Swamp on the Magic end. But I will say, in terms of like how useful this thing was, it's kind of like a mid-game item for you. It doesn't do top DPS. It's definitely the most fun with melee because of the crossbow range on it. So you could do things like a melee Zuck. You could do some different challenges with that as well. So like the Tizrek challenges, going through Jad, all of that made significantly easier. Even some of the Echo bosses as well, being able to essentially use melee, but at the range of a crossbow. So it did have its uses, and it definitely helped a lot with melee. Magic, it was okay as like a mid-game weapon. You still struggled a little bit with the splashing piece when you're going to like bosses, but it was kind of a mid-game upgrade for you. Range, it just didn't fare as well as the other options because you had knives at tier 3 mastery for range down to 1 tick, and they would just outperform this every time. And by the time you get up to like crossbows get the bolts with special attacks, so they end up performing better than this as well. So it didn't do super well for range, but definitely for melee. And I would personally consider this more of like a melee weapon than the other two. It was quite good for that. But again, because it was kind of mid-game, there was a lot of uses for melee, but it's kind of specific. I feel like it's very middle of the road, so I'm moving this into B. Man, I wish I could do better by the Nature's Reprisal. I love the idea of salamanders. It just struggles in the same way that salamanders do, though, unfortunately. Last, but certainly not least, we have the Soul Spear and the Soul Bracers. And man, these are so good. The items are just so good. The Soul Spear as like a special weapon, it scaled based on your prayer, and you can see I got the GIF here from the wiki, that AoE attack, and actually it could hit quite a lot. I think when I was with Last Stand, had kind of like all of the bonuses going for me, I was hitting close to 150, and you could get 3 specials at a time in this AoE range here. So I mean, you're talking a lot of damage in a really quick succession potentially, and it's to multiple targets. So actually, this got a lot of use out of it for me on my melee build, and I think it was super, super good. The stats on it, yeah, it's like technically weaker in terms of some other weapons that you get later into the game, but the fact that it had this AoE special, and the special did a lot, I think that really carried this weapon through to the point where you could use it in the late game, and it would actually feel quite good. Plus, if you didn't like the Soul Spear, you also had the Bracers alongside it. So these 2 items coming from one area, same with the Wilderness, just made it really, really strong as a region if you're going for these items. And this doubled your healing on any sources. And so like, it depended a little bit on what you had available to you, but like eating 1 angler became 2 anglers. So you could boost your health up to like 148 before going into a fight, which is crazy, right? It's a lot of health. Doubling your Blood Fury heals, doubling your Blood Spell heals, doubling what Guthans will heal. I mean, all of this stuff, right? Even the ranged healing, which was already really consistent. Now you get 12 heals every 5 attacks. Like, these things ended up being quite good. And while we'll talk about the bosses here in a minute, originally I was skeptical about putting it into S tier, but the fact that I actually didn't find Echo Soul to be that challenging as a boss by the time you got to him, it actually wasn't that bad to farm out the items, and you could really get a lot of use out of them. So I'd actually end up putting it above the Coppish Blade, just because the Bracers made everything so passive with all of that extra healing. And the AoE on the Spear, I mean, the Coppish and the Spear were kind of similar in damage. I'd probably say the Coppish did more damage overall. It was also just like an easier use case for it. But I think the Bracers kind of squeak this pair above the Wilderness. But definitely belongs in S tier. Really strong. Didn't have to be afraid of Echo Soul at all. I mean, even if you cheesed it and you like out-healed all of the stuffs that it did, I think anybody could actually get through Echo Soul. You just had to get through the Coliseum the first time, which I know, as someone who hadn't done the Coliseum before, it was challenging. But if you have Last Stand, if you have Banker's Note, you can also cheese your way through the Coliseum. So again, just as like a quick reference for where things have moved, this was the old ratings, and then this was the new rating. So actually, not a lot of stuff shifted around. I know Barrow's Gloves kind of took a bit of a hit. The Karen item took a little bit of a hit as well. But a lot of these kind of landed about where I expected, which is cool to see. And I do understand this is all very subjective. You can tell me I'm wrong. Tell me the Barrow's Gloves is the best item you've ever had. I look forward to hearing how you want to justify that. But I know, like, some of these items were more fun than others. I really wish, like, the Fremnik Jewelry was just a stat stick, and while that's fun to some extent, I really am a sucker for just, give me, like, some special bonuses, give me something different. But I really appreciate that out of these Echo items. The AoE spec on the Spear that scales with Prayer, the Coppish doing the sort of, like, AoE lightning double hit kind of thing. That type of stuff is really nice to see, even with the Ward. The Ward, stopping all of the sort of, like, negative effects that you can have in the game, it's really fun to play around with. Oh man, this is going to be a long video, isn't it? Who's still with me? Echo bosses. And to give myself a little bit of criteria, I'm going to be looking at the difficulty of accessing the boss. So basically, like, when you get into the boss, the mechanics, how fun it is to, like, actually do the boss, and the reward that you get from the boss itself. Starting with Echo KQ. This is the boss from the desert. Obviously the Calphite Queen. You had to fight the normal versions of all of the Echo bosses in order to earn your orb to fight the Echo related version, which dropped the special items. So you've got the orb drop right here, 1 out of 30. You've got the Drygore Blowpipe coming from the Echo KQ. at 1 out of 20. Both of these were guaranteed drops. So you had the orb. If you got to the 30 kills, you were guaranteed to get it. On any of the items, it was double whatever the drop rate was. So in this case, at most, you'd have to do 40 kills of the Echo Calphite Queen. And you can access this pretty much as early as you wanted. I mean, yes, Calphite Queen hits like a truck, so you probably still need some stats getting into it, but there's no other real requirements for it. And because of that, it was one of the easiest bosses to access. And the Dragor Blowpipe is actually an extremely strong item too. So if you're able to pick that up early, it would really help you out a lot. So I think kind of the combination of these together, the Blowpipe coming from the Echo KQ, which you can access early, just in general makes this quite a strong boss in terms of all of the echoes. Now, the mechanics themselves, and the fun factor is going to be really subjective, but the mechanics I think were fairly understandable. I went into all of the Echo bosses blind. Some of the folks in the chat on my streams would help a little bit if I asked to try and identify certain mechanics, but I tried my best to go into each of these fights blind. And this one, while I did get lucky on all of the items, so I didn't have to fight it a ton, I didn't mind what they were doing with this. I mean, the normal Calphite Queen fight is pretty bland, pretty straightforward, right? And I do think it was an overall improvement to Calphite Queen. I think it gave you a little bit more to kind of track in the fight. So in general, I feel pretty positively about Echo Calphite Queen. I think a lot of other people felt the same way as well. And while I don't necessarily consider this an S tier boss, I think it's a very solid entry for the Echo bosses. So top of A tier feels like a good place to start out. We'll see if I move in as I go through the other Echo bosses though. Next up we had Echo Cerberus. This one took 91 Slayer. Obviously in Asgardia, where Cerberus lives, man, the drop rate on these, it's one of the worst drop rates, if not the worst actually for the Echo Orb. I think there might be 2 bosses that had 1 out of 50. This was one of them. So you could have to kill 50 normal Cerberus. You have to get a task for it. You have to be a 91 Slayer. And then for the Dog Sword, you have to kill 50 of the Echo Cerb to guarantee it. I myself got 2 Dog Swords on the 50th kill, so take that as you will. And the item itself, I know we've talked about it as a bit of a meme weapon, so I don't think the reward really does much for you here, but I also don't think the fight for Cerberus was that difficult. It does take a little while to access, so kind of loses some points for taking a while to get into it, but I actually don't feel like it was that bad to get into, especially because you're probably doing a melee build if you're going to go Asgardia anyway. Now, in terms of the actual mechanics, they echo they echo the normal Cerberus mechanics pretty well. You're just getting a lot more ghosts to deal with. The sort of lava pools are longer, staying on the ground, but it's not crazy difficult to deal with. It's not exactly a super long fight either. And so in general, it's kind of middle of the road for me. I wouldn't necessarily say that I super enjoyed the mechanics, but it also wasn't bad either. So it's just more of the same from Cerberus, which isn't necessarily a problem. But because it's middle of the road, kind of gets a middle of the road rating, right? I mean, it can just sit in B tier. I mean, I could take it or leave it. And that's about it for Cerberus. Next up, you have Echo KBD in the Wilderness. Now, KBD is a very, very simplistic boss. 1 out of 30 on the Echo Orb, so quite easy to get into fairly early. All you really need is Dragonfire Protection and maybe a Rune Crossbow if you're going for the range build. Melee, it's a little more difficult to get into, but you can still get into it fairly early, going for a Zombie Axe or something like that. And then you have the Echo version dropping the Thunder Kompish and the Thousand Dragon Ward. And yes, the rewards are very good. It is very easy to access this boss. However, this boss fight sucks. Oh my god, dude. Okay, if you're a range build, it probably wasn't as bad for you, but if you were melee trying to come in here, screw that, dude. And I can't imagine it went much better for mage either, because you're probably splashing you're probably splashing 19 out of 20 of your attacks in a row just because he has such high mage defense. This boss fight takes forever, and you are having to deal with all of these stupid pools of garbage, spawning everywhere. Then you have the little dragon spawn, which the idea is cool, but man, it is so frustrating dealing with, especially the venom pools, because they just clutter up the entire arena. And it just makes it such a pain in the butt. And the fact that you're potentially gonna have to kill 50 of this boss to get these items. I got I don't even know if I'd call it lucky, but I had both of them within essentially like 40 kills. So I was slightly under the pity rate. Gosh dang, man, you're gonna tell me I have to put up with this thing for like 3 or 4 hours straight trying to kill it. These kills were not fast either. I had to go and like on my melee build get some very mild upgrades to try and just help myself through this, because otherwise it was gonna be like 5-minute kills, 4-minute kills, and that is a long time to be killing this. Oh god, dude, it annoys me so greatly. I would put it in D tier if not for the fact that the Coppish Blade and Thousand Dragon Ward are such good items. They are saving KBD right now. Oh my god, this dude, screw this boss. I don't want to see this dude ever again. This is like one of the most annoying. I'm not 100% sure if I'd rank it as like the worst fight. It's close though. I'm gonna have to think about that one. I've got another one that annoys me just about as much. Next up we have Mauritania, the Echo Grotesque Guardians. Required 75 Slayer, which was quite quick to get to. The Mauritania Echo Orb and 30 kills. That one's actually probably more annoying than going for the gloves themselves. Yes, it's 1 out of 25, meaning you might have to kill 50 of the Echo boss. But the nice thing that they did with this Echo boss is you essentially only have to kill the sort of like main Guardian, and that means you can stick to one style. So it's annoying to get to the orb because the Grotesque Guardians themselves, you have to melee one of them, you have to range the other, and so it's a bit of an annoying fight in terms of like you don't probably have a lot of league powers coming into this fight. But once you get the orb, the Echo, it's not that bad. It's definitely worse for people who had a melee build and they didn't have the Nature's Reprisal weapon, kind of be able to like range melee this thing. So my heart goes out to the folks who had to melee this boss. But let me just show you some of the mechanics. So like most of it, you just attack the boss, you run around a little. It's not that bad. When it gets low, it like throws you to the other side of the arena, then you just have to keep moving, right? It is definitely worse if you're melee because it will throw out even more stuff, so you have to be really careful how you walk. So definitely people who had to melee this boss, which is probably a lot of people, because I still think Mauritania is like the melee region to pick. You'll probably feel like this boss was worse than I felt like it was, but in general, like the reward is okay. The mechanics are fine. I don't know if I would necessarily go out of my way to farm this a lot, but I didn't necessarily hate it either. So again, it's kind of like a middle of the road boss. I liked it a little more than I liked Cerberus, and it is also easier to access, so you can kind of get that benefit from the Fancy Barrows gloves a little bit sooner, right? Like you're able to take advantage of that in the mid game and actually be able to use some of those armors to kind of like upgrade your gear later. But I don't know, I could take it or leave it in the same way I could take it or leave it with like the Echo Cerberus boss fight. But it is just a little bit better, I think, just because of kind of all of the things together. Now, back to things that I hate, Echo DKs in the Fremnik region. Normal DKs, very easy. The 1 out of 30 rate on the orb, I mean, that's basically nothing. You get that orb super fast. These bosses are like fairly easy to get into. But oh my god, the Echoes. Oh, dude. I don't know how you do this without Prayer Pen. Like, honestly, if you didn't get a tier 6 mastery, this boss fight would just suck. Yes, you get like one of the best items, or I guess best pair of items in the game, but you might have to kill them 50 times. I did this on my mage account. It isn't terrible, but it is so long, and it's just annoying. It's annoying in the same way like those Venom pools from KBD. Echo DKs, in that, especially in the last phase, it is just spamming all of that poison junk out there, and it just really sucks to deal with it. And if you were ranged, in the same way with all of these bosses, if you're ranged, you probably like a lot of these a lot better, because range made everything easy. Oh my god, being a mage on this boss, it was terrible. The amount of splashing, I don't know if melee would have been much better either, because it would have been tough to deal with the poison pools as a melee build trying to do this thing. I don't know how many people picked up Fremnik as a melee build, but if you did, you have to let me know how difficult this was for you. But I imagine that it wouldn't have been fun or easy for you as a melee build either. So, golly, dude, the poison pools are just like the most annoying thing. And there's so many of them. I actually, as I think about it, I think I dislike KBD more than I dislike the DKs, but it is pretty close. And the only reason it doesn't go into D tier is, again, because the S tier items, like, it is a terrible, terrible grind to get those items if you are not lucky. But when you get them, you're done with the boss, and you've got a really huge power spike. So the reward definitely offsets some of the pain of that boss, but man, golly, the poison pool mechanic is just so annoying, and golly, they put out just so many of them. drives me nuts. Probably didn't help that I did this with Mage. I mean, if I did it with something not Mage, I probably wouldn't hate it quite as much as KBD. Oh, dude, with Mage, though, you're splashing just all the time. Trying to get a hit on all 3 of the bosses as well to make sure that you get the drops from them all. God, that was such a pain in the butt. You didn't have to do it for the Echo items, so I definitely brought that pain upon myself, but I feel like if you're down there, you kind of want to, you know? Speaking of more things that I hate. Oh, Kandarin, why? Why, Kandarin? Why you gotta do this to yourself? Holy cow. Ecothermy, 93 Slayer, the highest requirement to get access to it. It's got the, again, like one of the worst drop rates for the Echo Orb, meaning you might have to kill it 50 times like the normal boss. Granted, the normal boss is pretty quick to kill, so it's not like terrible. But it's just, God, I'm already hating on this, you know, so it's like, the more time I have to spend here, God, okay, little tangent with this. They did not put a KC task for the thermonuclear smoke devil boss. Like, you had to kill it once, and like that was it. There's no 50, there's no 150, so like, you're just here for getting the Echo Orb, I guess. Sucks to suck, I don't know, dude. What a pain in the butt. Once you get the orb, you get access to Ecothermy. It has one of the trashiest items. It has the trashiest item of the Echo items. So like, you're grinding for a while to get the Slayer level. You get the orb. The boss isn't necessarily like the slowest kill, but it's also not the fastest kill. And if you have to kill 50 of them, it's super involved. I mean, just look at the mechanics for this thing. Like, I don't know. It's not very fun. And while I don't hate it as much as like KBD spawning Venom pools, the fact that you're not really rewarded in points or in items for farming this guy out. It just kind of, the whole experience is just bad, you know? And because of that, Ecothermy gets its own tier. You noticing the trend yet? Man, I wish I could put KBD down in the Thermy tier. I just can't, because the items are too good coming from Echo KBD. Poor Thermy gets to live alone down there. Golly, dude, it's just like, it's such an involved fight. If I take kind of the additional grind out of it, I could probably put it into like C or B tier, you know, with the other Slayer stuff. But I'm like, considering everything together, and I mean, Kandarin's a bad region too. Well, we'll get to it, but spoilers, Kandarin's not a good region for a number of reasons. And it really, all of this works together to just make it like a really terrible experience to get to. Like, you're only doing it because at that point, you really want the mastery point, and you unfortunately locked in Kandarin, so like, you gotta go get the mastery point. You know what I mean? Like, maybe because there's so few people, you want to kill it for the high scores. You know, I guess maybe that's the other thing that you'd go for. I don't know. Moving on to Echo Hunalith, which was the Taranwen Echo boss. The nice thing about this is the orb comes pretty quick. You're already going to have to farm the Corrupted Gauntlet because you want to get those armor seeds for the item that you're going to pick up later. You probably want to get yourself the enhanced weapon seed as well. Once you get the orb, you can go and you can fight the Echo Hunalith. One of the big things about this is it cuts out the prep phase for the Corrupted Gauntlet. Now, yes, Echo Hunalith is harder, but the fact that it can save you so much time once you get good at it, I think is really important. And the mechanics are more difficult, and I think debatably this may be the hardest Echo boss out of all of them, even harder than Echo Soul, just because you can't bring in other types of gear into the gauntlet, so you're forced to just use whatever they give you. And if that ends up not being enough for you, it can make it extremely difficult. And I know a lot of people struggle with this. You know, the extra tornadoes, if you didn't have prayer pen, having to deal with like switching your weapons, doing the little special attack thing every 25% health, like all of that together did make this boss fight a lot to deal with. And yes, the Crystal Blessing itself I put into A tier, but it is a good reward. And if you're already in Taranwen, you're already doing the gauntlet, like you're gonna be farming it out, and this actually saves you so much time. It essentially cuts your grind in half because you don't have to do the prep for Echo Gauntlet. And you're still getting all of the other drops associated, right? It still has the same drop table as the Echo Gauntlet. So because of that, I actually value that time save so much. I am willing to put this in S tier. And I know there's going to be people who really struggle with this boss because it is so difficult. And for those folks, I totally understand if you rank this thing in Kandarin tier. But for me, I was able to mostly get this one down. It saved me a pretty good amount of time farming out the armor seeds. And I think that's really important for getting to the item. Like, I didn't really talk about it. The Crystal Blessing, you get it 1 out of 15. So at most, you're going to be running 30 of these Echo kills. But you're probably better off continuing on with the Echo stuff just because it saves you that much time. And especially on things like the enhanced weapon seed, where you could potentially go pretty dry on it and have to do like 100 Echo gauntlets. this thing cutting your time down from like 6-7 minutes on a really like you're honed in on that Echo Gauntlet, right? Like you have to be pretty good to get those times down, and turning that into maybe like a 3-minute or a 4-minute gauntlet, it's going to save you so much time over the course of your grinding if you're going for that enhanced crystal weapon seed. I think that's really what sells this boss for me. That and the mechanics were very well highlighted. It's not so different to the normal like corrupted gauntlet Hunalith. It's just like a little bit of a leveled up version from that. And even though I probably complained a lot on stream while I was doing it, if I was doing it off stream where I didn't necessarily have to worry about like chatting with folks, I actually found it was somewhat enjoyable to do, even because like once you get into the pattern, you can get into the recognition of it. It's good. The rewards are good. It saves you a lot of time, right? It kind of plays in with that reward piece. And so for me, I think this is going to be the first S tier entry for the Echo bosses. But feel free to tell me I'm crazy. I do know this one was quite difficult and debatably the hardest Echo boss of the bunch. Next up, we have got Echo Hespori in Kourend. The nice thing about this one is, well, I didn't list this here. You needed 60 some farming in order to like plant the Hespori. You need to get the seed, but that was a relatively quick thing to do. You could plant this on day 1. You did have to wait for Hespori to grow, so it'd take, you know, like 6 something hours with the farming boost. But you only have to kill the normal Hespori once to get the Echo Orb, which meant that the Nature's Reprisal as a reward was quite easy to pick up. And since it is a mid-game weapon, you really wanted to pick it up fairly early as an upgrade for yourself. And I just feel like this worked really well to give that to you. It also meant that you could farm some seeds out from Hespori if you wanted to. The Echo version, in terms of the mechanics, they're very similar to normal Hespori, it's just more of it. And I think the Echo bosses that did this, it makes a lot of sense, right? It's just a leveled up version of Hespori. Not all of the bosses have mechanics where they could do that. So like KBD doesn't have a lot of mechanics, so a leveled up version of KBD is going to be a little bit more interesting because they have a little more like space to play around with than something like Hespori, which is newer, you know, it's not that new, but it's a newer boss, right, in comparison to KBD. So the mechanics themselves, not necessarily that difficult to do, which again, the reward isn't like anything crazy, but since you do want to pick it up early, I think it just fit really well together. So I want to put this in A tier. I don't think it quite gets above like the Cowfight Queen in terms of the fight and kind of the reward that came from it. But the fact that you get this mid-game weapon quite early, it's a nice little progression upgrade. It gives you access to your mastery point as well very early. And so I really liked the spot that Hespori fit into. And it didn't have any sort of like super annoying or weird mechanics to deal with. It was just more of what you were used to in the Hespori fight. Just a little bit more complex than the normal Hespori fight. And then again, certainly last but not least, Echo Soul coming from Barlamore. You did have to beat the normal Coliseum, which I know is challenging for folks. Again, I had never done the Coliseum. I was able to make my way through it after a couple of tries. Did have to cheese it a little bit with Last Stand, but like I get there. I didn't have Banker's Note. I think if you did, you could probably get through this on your first try if you had the supplies to actually like use with Banker's Note. And you're guaranteed the Echo Orb on the first completion. So when we talk about like the time save from the Echo Hunalith, Echo Soul was kind of that same thing. It let you skip all of the waves and just challenge Soul again. And the items were very low in terms of the drop rate. So while Echo Soul is a pretty difficult fight, you got the items fairly quickly as well. You wouldn't have to kill more than 14 of Echo Soul if you were just going for both of the items there. Now, mechanic-wise, this thing is like a hot mess. It gets significantly more challenging to kind of navigate the field that you're fighting him in as the fight goes on. But one of the things that really helped me with Echo Soul was being able to cheese it with heals. So the farther into the game you got, the more powerful it got, the more gear that you had. Ranged and melee especially, I think, would have an easy time. Mage, I'm not so sure how well blood spells would hit Soul, but assuming you don't splash like an ungodly amount, I think every combat style likely had a way to kind of like cheese this fight. And man, you camp Guthans, avoid the little like sand spots and the giant lasers when they come through, you get this guy. And while at the beginning I wasn't quite as good at doing Echo Soul, this was one that I actually enjoyed enough that I ended up going back and farming him out quite a bit more. I think I ended up with like 50 KC at Echo Soul, somewhere in that range. While I never felt like I could perfectly do the mechanics of Echo Soul, once you got the bracers, once you had the Sunlight Spear, the fight was significantly easier. Being able to like increase your healing, just kind of out heal all of his damage. You could ignore a lot of the mechanics. And so while it was technically a difficult boss, it was it had a lot more viability to just like cheese it. And again, I really value that time save. The items are super good, and it really felt like when you were grinding it out, the rewards that you got were worth the effort that you put in. And the fact that I even felt like this one, not a lot of the bosses I was like, oh boy, let me go back and farm these. Echo Soul was one where I was like, you know what? I actually don't mind going back and trying this boss some more. And I actually feel like I could learn the mechanics given enough time where I might be able to, I don't know if I'd ever get to the point where I could like perfectly do Echo Soul, but I could reasonably do a lot of the mechanics of Echo Soul by the time I got to the end of the league. And so I just feel like the design of it, even though again, it was one of the more difficult bosses, it all worked really well. Now, I didn't think I'd be putting the hardest bosses at the top of S tier. You could tell me I'm crazy. Like, don't get me wrong. I understand these two bosses out of the rest of these, like, these were definitely the most difficult. And that probably takes it away for some people. It'd knock it down some tiers. But for me, I was able to learn my way through these. I felt like the rewards were kind of worth that grind. And they both had such big time saves as well. I mean, you could grind out the Coliseum and get all the rewards that you wanted just by taking down Echo Soul, which was like a 1.5, 2-minute fight for me. Something like that by the end of it. So really, it was like a big time saver as well. And I really value that when we're talking about like grinding out all of this stuff in leagues, because there's a lot of stuff that you have to grind, and you don't necessarily want to be stuck trying to get mainstays of your gear or some of these higher point tasks and having it take like 20 hours. I mean, you don't want to be kind of like having to drag yourself through that. And I think both of these really, really helped with that. All right, you still with me? We are on to the areas, and I don't have a lot of specific stuff to say about the areas. I think on the deep dives, I did a pretty good job nailing down most of it. I did have a couple of specific thoughts before I go and rank them all again. And just for reference, this was where I had originally put all of the different areas right before the league started. So this was going through the deep dives and kind of seeing how I felt about the different things that these areas had to offer. Now, Kourend, while I do really like Kourend as a skilling region, man, Chambers was the saddest one for purples, and you really felt it. By comparison to like Theater of Blood and Tombs of a Masket, it really did not compare. I know a lot of people who they only had Kourend as an option, and especially if you were a mage build in Kourend, which I do think was the right decision. But man, if you went dry on that mega rare voucher and you had to do 100 challenge mode raids, it felt so terrible. I also wanted to just complain a little bit about the Golden Tench. I mean, it was only like a 200-point task. I did go for it, but man, that thing is still like, the task associated to the whatever fishing there, terribly slow. Still hate it. Still hate that it was on that list. I really wish they could have taken that one off or like made that a little easier to get to. But that one's like a small gripe. I really think the saddest part for Kourend was the fact that challenge modes, it did not compare to the other two raids. The other two raids were way faster at getting purples. It was way easier to get yourself those mega rare vouchers that you're hunting for, even if you went dry. And then of course you have Kandarin. Some specific thoughts about Kandarin. We did get a banger of a song out of that dude.
The dungeons are empty, the streets are bare, echoes of battles that no longer care. Rip Kandarin, where light once shone. Now all that remains are the echoes alone.
The echo is alone indeed, and the echo itself not even good. Echo boss not good, echo item not good. And, oh my god, the amount of problems in Kandarin. I know I mentioned this before for corner cutters, like not cutting the monkey laps in half. Yes, they didn't do as many like monkey backpack tasks, but you still, I think it capped out at like 500. You had to do all 500 of those laps, even if you took corner cutter. Man, what a blow for corner cutters everywhere, dude. If you happen to be in Kandarin, that really sucked. There were some issues with like some of the quests because like certain things were auto-completed elsewhere or in a certain state. So like the Temple of Ikov, you couldn't complete because the NPC to like progress the story forward just wasn't there. You had tasks that were impossible without like certain relics. So like slaying a Bloodveld in Kandarin, not only was it less points than like the other slay Bloodvelds in like other regions, it was a 10-pointer in Kandarin, but also you couldn't get Bloodveld tasks in Kandarin, which meant if you didn't have the Slayer relic, you couldn't do that task. And there were a handful of them that fell into that category. And this was one of the best clue regions, or at least it was meant to be, because you can pickpocket like every tier of clue besides Master on different NPCs in Kandarin. And you could get like Sherlock and Fallow steps on these high-level clues for areas that you didn't have, and so you'd end up having to drop them. And while it's not like a crazy big deal, all of these little things, plus the fact that like Fremnik Jewelry kind of took Kandarin's main role, and then magic being weaker, all these full items being everywhere in the game, so like you're losing out on some of those combos that run through Kandarin, Grimoire taking away the prayer from Kandarin, like all of these things together, like you just can't have these sort of like little issues existing here, because it just makes the area feel that much worse. People who took Kandarin, I mean, yes, there's some like skilling stuff in there that you can enjoy, but man, I mean, as like a combat region, useless. Unless you really like the stuff that's there. I mean, it was a sad region, dude. I picked it on the mage. Never have I felt more regret. Not only was I mage, but I picked Kandarin. Oh man, both of those things together, that was rough, dude. So again, this was the old ratings. Kind of going back through the list, here's where I would shift things around to. Kandarin gets its own tier. I mean, we're just keeping to the trend at this point. I am moving down Karen just because Chambers hurt me. Chambers hurt a lot of people, dude. I'm telling you, it is still probably like the single best skilling region, but the fact that the raids just were not on par, and a lot of people, when you come into the game for leagues, like, you want to get that mega rare voucher. You want to get those big weapons. You want to have those, and Chambers was just a bit of a letdown for that. I also moved the desert up. I know this area, a lot of people really love the desert, and I'll agree. Having gone through the desert, the stuff that I thought I wouldn't like about the desert really wasn't that bad. Tombs was also a pretty fun time. You could do it solo, you could do it in groups, so I quite enjoyed that. I have shifted Varlamore down because I didn't actually find that a lot of the content was that useful. It's very like early mid-game friendly stuff, and in leagues where you kind of catapult your way through the early and the mid-game, it really ended up not being that important. It did give a lot of different options for you, so it's not like it was a bad region by any means, and it does have really good coverage overall. Just a lot of the stuff that it offers gets outclassed elsewhere, and so I think it makes sense that it be kind of like a middle-of-the-road region just because of that. Though again, none of these are necessarily bad besides Kandarin, as long as you kind of got like a specific idea in mind as you're using them. Now, the Wilderness, I did end up pushing up a little bit higher. I know people are really tough on the Wilderness, but the support that it offers, just every time I take it, I continue to feel the same way. Prints money, solves prayer for you, and it has a lot of like decent skilling options. It provides just a ton of resources as well. And also the tasks within the Wilderness are generally pretty quick to get through. And so there's a lot of positive things that come from the Wilderness. And the fact that in leagues, you don't lose stuff if people go and PK you. Like, while I was out there, I think I only ever had one person attack me on my account that had the Wilderness. Like, it really was not a big deal at all. So while the league is over, when you're considering areas for next year, if they end up doing the same sort of map split, I highly recommend, think about the Wilderness. It's got a lot of good things to offer. I think everything else is about the same. I moved Asgarnia down a little just because I really felt like it kind of has a similar problem to Varlamore, where the stuff that it does, it tends to get outclassed by other regions. And especially because of some of the echoes and like the full completed items in other areas, Asgarnia had way less power in it than it would have otherwise. Like, yes, it's cool to go and get like Torva from Nex, but if you're going for Torva, you're probably better off taking Taranwin. And I just feel like a lot of what Asgarnia had to offer, you kind of ended up going down that same route. That and losing XP on the pest control boats really, really hurt pest control. That thing was dead towards like the last couple of weeks of leagues. Very difficult to get people together to run those boats if you happen to be building like an alt in the region. And while Void ranging was like the best range setup that you could do if you were tier 6, the other armors just don't have a lot to offer. It's tough to put together the regions to get like the better version of Void. So I don't know. I don't think that Asgardia had a lot of strong offerings this time around. So we have now talked about everything. Golly, it's been like an hour podcast talking about the leagues. Goodness. Since we've talked about everything, I want to kind of compare this league against the other leagues. Now, I have played all of these except for the Twisted League, so I have to do a little bit of like hearsay on the Twisted League. I did watch a lot of Twisted League content, so I at least have some context around that. And when I look at all of these, a lot of people have asked me, is this my favorite league? And I will say it is not, but that isn't because this league is bad or anything. It's because my first league was the Trailblazer League, the second league there, and experiencing leagues for the first time I think is a lot of fun. And while it is still fun in subsequent leagues, it's hard to do better than that experience. But that said, I do think looking at all of these leagues, Leagues 5 is still probably the best designed league out of the bunch. So if I had to rank them, I'd probably do it like this. I think Raging Echoes belongs at the top. I'll be really curious to see how many people agree with me here, but I really feel like the quality of life that they did in kind of opening up these choices, the things that they made available to you in the different areas, from like full items, completing certain quests, like they've really honed in on the ideas around these area lockings. And I think this league, they executed that quite well. And the Echoes really just complemented that for the different areas. And it made for a lot of flexibility in the different choices. And I don't think you'd feel bad about any of the choices that you made. As much as I harp on something like Mage, and I think Mage and Kandrin in this league definitely got like the dirtiest treatment out of the bunch. But even still, you would have had fun either way, So like, I'm coming from the standpoint of, I tried every single area combination, so I have a lot to like compare between. If you only did a Mage setup and you picked this stuff, I don't think you would hate it. And I just want to give kudos to the team, because I think they've really locked in that idea of like the flexibility of area picks. Like you could do just about any combination that you wanted, and you would have a really solid account. You'd have a lot of fun with it. And so in general, they've kind of over time gone in the right direction. I mean, I really like Trailblazer as well. I put that one in second for the reloaded version. The original Trailblazer, really, like, it's almost in chronological order. It's just Shattered Relics. There were some things that they did in Shattered Relics that didn't sit very well with me. Like when it was a cool concept, and I appreciate what they tried. Being able to unlock different parts of the game, that was really cool. But the fact that you could unlock everything in the game, and you were kind of left over with the in-game currency that they use to unlock things, you were left with a ton of that. It really made the choices feel way less meaningful. And so that's why I put Shattered Relics at the bottom. That and the fact it was such a pain in the butt to switch between the powers in Shattered Relics. For those who didn't experience it, you could essentially get all of the relics in the game, but you had to equip certain ones to get like different combos. The UI was really not good for that at the time. And so it made it really tedious to switch out all of these different relics over and over. Because like anytime you wanted to go do something, you felt like you had to switch your relics to kind of like optimize what you were doing in that moment. And that meant switching basically all of them out. And it was just a terrible interface for it. So you'd end up spending a couple minutes at the bank every time you wanted to switch between activities. And it just really dragged down the momentum of that game mode. But all in all, I've really liked all of the leagues. I wouldn't necessarily say that I've hated any of them. But Leagues 5, I do think reigns supreme out of this bunch. But what do you think? For those who have played a lot of leagues, or maybe played just this one, how do you feel about it? Do you like it? Would you call this your favorite league? But all right, I've been yapping a lot. Professional yapper here. Woo, yapping done. Thanks for watching. We've had a lot of activity on the channel over the course of the league. Tons of streams. I appreciate you all kind of joining in with that. I am going to be doing more content following the league, but I am going to take about a 2 or 3 week break just to kind of create a little bit of space, wind down, clean up some stuff on the back end. If you want to stay in touch, make sure to subscribe. You can join the Discord as well. I'll have that linked down below. Otherwise, if you're just around for the league and this is the last that you see from me over the course of the next year, then have a good rest of the year, and I look forward to seeing you in the next league. Take care.